All right, get ready, folks, because today we're going deep on a topic that's both fascinating and a little bit freaky.
Yeah, we're talking about robots,
Robots.
but not just any robots.
Right. Not like, are they going to take over the world kind of robots?
Well, maybe a little bit of that,
Okay, maybe a little bit.
but more specifically, we're diving into how the way a robot looks.
How human or not human they look.
Exactly how that actually changes how we feel about them, how comfortable we are with them being near us.
It's all about personal space, but for robots.
Yeah.
And it's way more complicated than you might think.
I mean, think about it. Would you want a robot butler that looked like a real person standing in your kitchen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I love the idea of having a robot do my dishes, but do I want it staring at me with realistic human eyes while it does it?
Right. And that's exactly the kind of question that this research paper tackles head on.
The paper is called Human Perception of Robot Anthropomorphic Design in Different Spatial Relationships.
Catchy, right?
Yeah, super catchy. But honestly, it's a really interesting study that dives into how our comfort levels with robots change based on how close they are to us and how human-like they appear.
And what's cool is that they actually break it down to those different zones of personal space that we all have. You know, like that invisible bubble we have around us.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like someone standing too close to me in line at the grocery store. Instant discomfort.
Exactly. So this study looks at those zones, but in the context of robots. They call them intimate space, personal space, social space, and public space.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. So let's break it down, starting with intimate space. What exactly are we talking about here?
So in this study, they use the example of a robot helping someone with their jacket. You know, like a date kind of scenario.
Okay, so picture this. You're reaching for your coat, and this robot leans in to help. And get this, the research found that people actually preferred the most human-like robot in this situation.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, right?
Totally. You'd think being that close to a super realistic robot would be creepy.
Well, that's where it gets interesting. It seems that in those very close, intimate interactions, those human-like features actually help to build trust and connection.
So it's like, if a robot is going to be that close to me, I'd rather it look like a person than like a metal box with claws.
Pretty much. And this actually ties into a lot of research on human psychology and how we're wired to respond to those familiar human cues.
Okay, but hold on a sec. Doesn't this contradict that whole uncanny valley theory?
You know, the idea that robots get creepier the closer they look to humans?
Exactly. So how does that fit in here?
Well, they actually addressed that in the study. And what they found is that the most human-like robot they used was so realistic that it seemed to jump right over that valley of creepiness.
Like it was so realistic, it just looped back around to being acceptable.
Exactly. And maybe it's like with anything new.
Like the first time people saw cars, they were probably freaked out, right?
Exactly. But then we get used to it and it becomes normal.
So maybe those initial feelings of creepiness with robots are just because we're not used to them yet.
Could be. But it's also important to remember that everyone's different. Some people might always prefer their robots to look like, well, robots.
Totally. Like my grandma still uses a flip phone.
Exactly. There's a whole spectrum of comfort levels when it comes to technology.
Okay, so in intimate space, the super realistic robots have a bit of an edge. But what happens when we move a little further out into personal space?
Think of it like this.
Like you've got a robot butler bringing you a drink. Still close, but not quite as intimate as the jacket scenario.
Right. And in this zone, the highly realistic robots are still preferred.
But there's a but coming, isn't there?
But the gap narrows. The less realistic robots start to become more acceptable in this personal space zone.
So it's like we still want our robot butler to be somewhat human-like, but maybe not so much that it starts feeling a little too real.
That's a great way to put it. It seems like in personal space, that sense of control becomes more important.
Like, I want my robot to make me a sandwich, but I don't want it judging my taste in bread.
Right. And the study actually used pictures of some real-world robots in their scenarios.
Oh, like those robots you see at tech conferences.
Exactly. And one of them was Sophia.
Sophia,
Yeah.
that super advanced AI robot that can, like, hold conversations and stuff.
Yep, that's her. And what's interesting is that while Sophia is incredibly advanced, people generally preferred a less realistic robot for tasks like, fetching things or providing assistance.
So even though Sophia is super cool, she might be a bit too human for a butler role.
It seems that way. People seem to want a certain level of, I don't know, subservience in their personal robots. Like they want to feel like they're still in charge.
Makes sense. I mean, I'm all for robots making my life easier, but I don't want them staging a coup in my living room.
Exactly. No one wants a robot uprising. So it seems like in personal space, there's a bit of a sweet spot when it comes to human likeness.
Not too human, not too robotic, just rough.
Exactly. But now things get really interesting when we move into social space.
Social space. What's that all about?
Think restaurants, cafes, places where we're interacting with people, but not on a deeply personal level.
Got it. So, like, did this super realistic robot finally meet its match in this zone? Could people finally start preferring something a little less, well, human?
Well, the results are a bit surprising. The most human-like robot still got the highest scores in this zone.
So, even in social situations, we still kind of like those realistic robots, but I'm guessing it wasn't as clear cut as in the other zones.
You're catching on quick.
Uh huh.
The less realistic robots were much closer in terms of appropriateness in social space.
So, it's like our tolerance for those robotic features starts to broaden as the interactions become less personal.
That's a great way to put it. It seems that in social spaces, it's less about how real the robot looks and more about how well it can do its job.
Like, if a robot waiter brings me my food on time and doesn't spill anything, I'm probably not going to care too much about whether it looks like Brad Pitt or C3PO.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, because the study also introduced a robot that scored surprisingly well in social spaces, despite having very minimal human features.
Oh, tell me more about this robot superstar.
They called it Robot A1, and it was clearly a robot, not trying to pass for a human. But it did have one key human-like feature.
Through
Eyes.
the styes.
Yep, and those eyes were enough to make a big difference.
So even with just that one human-like feature, A1 was still seen as capable and approachable in a social setting,
It's like those eyes were enough to trigger our social instincts.
without creeping us out with too much realism.
Right. Which brings us to our final frontier, public space.
Okay, public space. Now we're talking airports, train stations, those places where you're surrounded by people but not really interacting with them on a personal level.
Exactly, and this is where the research takes the most dramatic turn. Are you ready for it?
Hit me with it.
In public spaces, the least human-like robots were actually the most preferred.
Wait, what? So you're telling me that if I'm in the airport, I'd rather see a robot cleaning the floors that looks like R2-D2 than one that looks like, I don't know, George Clooney?
You got it.
Yeah.
It seems that when we're out in public, our priorities shift again.
Like, we're okay with robots being our companions or helpers, but when it comes to public safety and order, we want a clear distinction between man and machine.
That's exactly what the research suggests. It seems like in those public spaces, a highly realistic robot can actually make us feel uneasy.
It's like we don't want those robots blending in too much. We want to know who's in charge.
It seems that way. And this is where we start to see how those perceptions of robots are tied to our own sense of control and security.
So the closer a robot gets to us, both physically and in terms of its role in our lives, the more important those human-like features become for building trust and connection.
Exactly. But as we move into those more public and impersonal spaces, those same features can actually backfire, making us feel uneasy and potentially even threatened.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. Who knew there was so much nuance to how we perceive robots?
It's more complex than it seems on the surface.
Yeah,
And it raises a lot of interesting questions about how we'll design and interact with robots in the future.
absolutely. And speaking of the future, we're just getting started. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the ethical and societal implications of all this.
Oh yeah, things are about to get really interesting.
So don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back after the break. Okay, so we're back, and my head is officially spinning after that first part. I mean, who knew there was so much to unpack when it comes to robots in personal space?
Right. It's really fascinating stuff, and it gets even deeper when we start to consider the broader ethical and societal implications.
Oh, yeah, because it's one thing to talk about whether we prefer a robot butler with or without realistic eyes, but it's a whole other ball game when we start thinking about robots that look and act almost indistinguishable from humans.
Exactly. And that's where those ethical concerns really come to the forefront. Like, how do we ensure that these incredibly sophisticated robots are used responsibly and ethically?
Okay, so let's dive into those ethical concerns. What are some of the big challenges that come to mind when we start thinking about robots that are essentially blurring the lines between human and machine?
Well, one that immediately jumps out is the potential for deception. As robots become more sophisticated and lifelike, there's a growing risk that people might not even realize they're interacting with a machine, or they might be misled into thinking that a robot has real feelings or consciousness when it doesn't.
Okay, that's a little creepy. I mean, I can see how that could happen, especially with those super realistic robots that are designed to mimic human expressions and behaviors.
Exactly. And that raises a whole host of ethical dilemmas. For example, what happens when a robot is designed to be incredibly persuasive? Could it be used to manipulate people even subtly into making decisions that aren't in their best interest?
Ooh, that's a good point. I mean, we've all seen those sci-fi movies where robots are used to trick people or control their minds. Is that something we should be worried about in the real world?
Well, it's definitely something we need to be mindful of. I'm not saying we're on the verge of a robot takeover or anything, but as this technology advances, we need to be aware of the potential for misuse.
So it's not just about the technology itself, but about how it's used and who's controlling it.
Precisely. And that's why it's crucial to have these conversations now before this technology becomes so widespread that we can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Okay, so deception is a big one. What other ethical concerns are on your radar?
Well, another big concern is the potential impact on human connection. As robots become more integrated into our lives, will we start to prefer their company to that of our fellow humans?
I've heard that argument before. The idea is that robots are always predictable, they always follow orders, they never challenge us or disagree with us. And some people worry that those qualities might make them more appealing than the messiness of real human relationships.
Right. And it's not just about companionship. Think about robots in the workplace. As robots become more capable, there's a real risk that they will displace human workers, leading to widespread unemployment and economic instability.
Okay, so now we're talking about robots taking our jobs. That's a whole other level of concern. I mean, how do we prepare for a future where robots are doing many of the jobs that humans currently do?
That's a huge question, and there's no easy answer. Some experts believe that we need to rethink the very nature of work in a world where robots are capable of performing so many tasks.
So are we talking about a future where humans don't have to work at all? Like a robot utopia where we all just sit back and relax while the machines do everything for us?
Well, that's one possibility, but it raises a whole new set of questions about how we structure society and distribute resources. Other experts believe that we need to focus on developing new skills and creating new types of jobs that robots can't easily replicate.
So like those jobs that require creativity, critical thinking, and those uniquely human skills that robots haven't quite mastered yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those skills will become even more valuable in a world where robots are taking over many of the routine tasks. So it's not just about fearing robots, it's about adapting and evolving alongside them.
I like that perspective. It's not about humans versus robots. It's about finding ways for humans and robots to coexist and collaborate effectively.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that requires careful consideration of the ethical and societal implications we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm.
We need to make sure that the robots we create are aligned with our values and serve the best interests of humanity as a whole.
Well said. So I think it's safe to say that the future of robots is not just about technological advancement. It's about having these important conversations and making conscious choices about how we want this technology to shape our world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation today, because the choices we make now will have a profound impact on the future of both humans and robots.
Okay, so we've explored some of the potential pitfalls of the robot revolution, but now it's time to shift gears and talk about solutions. Because, let's face it, robots are here to stay, and it's up to us to figure out how to make this whole thing work for the benefit of humanity. All right, so we've talked about the potential downsides of this whole robot thing, but I'm ready for some good news. Let's talk solutions. What can we actually do to make sure robots are a force for good in the world?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that we have a choice in all this.
Yeah.
Technology isn't some unstoppable force, it's a tool. And like any tool, it's up to us to decide how we use it.
Okay, so we're not powerless in all this, but how do we actually shape the future of robots in a way that benefits humanity?
Well, for starters, we need to be having these conversations, like bringing together experts from different fields, engineers, ethicists, policymakers, to develop guidelines and regulations for robot development and use.
So, kind of like a rule book for robots, but how do we make sure those rules are actually followed?
That's where transparency comes in. We need to design robots in a way that makes it clear they're machines, not humans.
So, no more trying to make robots look exactly like us, especially in those situations where we saw it could lead to discomfort or distrust.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. We can create robots that are aesthetically pleasing and capable of natural interaction without blurring those lines between human and machine.
I like that. So no more super realistic robot security guards at the airport.
Well, maybe not. It's about understanding the context and designing robots that fit appropriately into those different social spaces.
Okay, so transparency in design is one piece of the puzzle. What else can we do to ensure that robots are used ethically?
We also need to be thinking about robot behavior, like how do we program robots to act in ways that align with our values?
Oh, like a robot code of ethics. But how do we actually translate those ethical principles into lines of code?
It's a complex challenge, but I think it starts with clearly defining those principles.
Yeah.
Things like prioritizing human safety and well-being, respecting privacy and autonomy, and avoiding any form of manipulation or coercion.
So basically, programming robots to be good citizens. But even if we manage to crack the code on robot ethics, there's still that big issue of job displacement. What happens when the robots start taking our jobs?
That's a valid concern, and it's something we need to address head on. I think the key is to be proactive. We need to invest in education and training programs that equip people with the skills they'll need to thrive in a future workforce that will increasingly rely on automation.
So focusing on skills that robots can't easily replicate, things like creativity, problem solving, and those uniquely human skills that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Those skills will become even more valuable in a world where robots are taking over many of the routine tasks. We need to focus on what makes us uniquely human.
It sounds like a pretty big shift, not just in terms of how we work, but also how we view ourselves and our place in the world.
It is. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations now before those changes are upon us. We have the power to shape the future of robots and to create a world where both humans and robots can thrive.
That's a message I can get behind. It's been quite a journey exploring all the facets of this robot revolution, but I have to say I'm feeling a lot more optimistic now than when we started.
Me too. And I think that's the key takeaway here. This isn't a time for fear or panic. It's a time for thoughtful action, for collaboration, and for embracing the possibilities that this technology offers.
Beautifully said. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.